Many corporate journalists are very fond of trying to draw a distinction between what they call real reporting, which is noble and elevated and honorable, even though for them it usually consists of little more than calling the CIA and the FBI and writing down what they tell you to say, as opposed to media criticism, which they regard as tawdry and trivial. Now, it is, of course, unsurprising that employees of corporate media outlets would seek to denigrate and minimize anything designed to put them and the many flaws of their work under a microscope. So their antipathy to what they call media criticism or media critics, always said with a condescending sneer, can be reasonably dismissed as nothing more than self-interested whining. But I actually regard the attempt to insist upon this distinction as quite revealing, one that provides insight into how these corporate outlets have come to see their role in the world. Now, there's no universal definition for what journalism is, or even what constitutes reporting. It can mean a lot of different things in a lot of different contexts, but I think we can identify foundational values, defining goals that distinguish journalism from other activities. These are the goals and functions that render journalism, when it is done well, as genuinely necessary to a healthy and functioning democracy. The reason the American founders decreed it as a guaranteed right in the First Amendment, one that could not be infringed upon for any reason. They did that precisely, or presumably, because they believed that a free press was essential for maintaining the equilibrium with which they were obsessed with preserving. The system of checks and balances that would ensure that no one institution or individual could ever acquire the kind of unchecked power that allowed the British monarch to act with such arbitrary force and under such personal whim that they were willing to fight an extremely risky war against the then most powerful empire on earth in order to liberate themselves from those abuses. So if journalism does nothing else, it must exist to impose checks and accountability on society's most powerful institutional actors. The unique attributes that journalism can impose on such institutions, transparency, investigative scrutiny, questioning, dissent, are vital to ensuring that those actors remain limited, humble, and in check. I think very few people, even those who consider themselves journalists in the corporate world, would find those basic principles I just outlined objectionable. But what many of them overlook, or more accurately, what they choose to deny, is that near the top of the list of powerful institutional actors in need of journalistic scrutiny are the very gigantic media corporations that are their employers. Highlighting the corruption and deceit of, say, Goldman Sachs or the CIA is no more or less urgent than doing the same for NBC News and the New York Times. All powerful institutional entities need investigative scrutiny, unflinching critiques, and pushback against their propaganda and deceit. And that most definitely includes, perhaps especially includes, the media conglomerates that control the nation's airways and printing presses, and which purport to disseminate the news and analysis of our politics to tens of millions of people. As a result, what they try to mock and minimize as mere media criticism, something in their eyes barely different than idle gossip, is, to me, not only real reporting, but some of the most important and valuable real reporting that one can do. If one affirms that journalism exists to place the actions of powerful institutions under an investigative microscope, but then excludes gigantic media corporations from the list of institutions that receive that kind of attention, then one is permitting those corporations to become exactly the kind of unchecked, unlimited power centers that the founders most feared. Worse, it will ensure that these corporate giants have the power to propagandize the population without any real or systemic pushback or investigation, because those who perform those services have been successfully marginalized as lowly media critics rather than people who do real reporting. And that is why I have always categorically rejected, not just as artificial but dangerous, this self-serving attempt to differentiate critiques of media outlets from real journalism. Indeed, I have come to believe that debunking the propaganda and disinformation of the nation's most powerful media corporations is arguably the most valuable and necessary form of real reporting. It's what enables us to liberate ourselves from the kind of propagandistic prism in which we would be permanently detained absent the ability to critique these institutions. That's a lesson that I actually learned very early on in my decision to begin writing about politics in 2005. When I started doing that, I had not been trained as a journalist. I had no intention of paying much attention to media corporations, let alone spending much of my time critiquing what it was that they were doing. My range of interests and why I began to write about politics was far more limited. I was setting out to critique the civil liberties assaults being waged under the banner of the War on Terror, and I was approaching it mostly as a constitutional lawyer. I was offended by the kinds of programs that denied due process by imprisoning people without trial, or that spied and surveilled American citizens without the warrants required both by the Constitution and by law. Those were the values and the interests I was seeking to vindicate and to report on and to shed light on, and I was doing it from a very limited perspective, largely as a journalist turned writer trying to convey complex constitutional principles to people who had not gone to law school. But what I realized very early on was that it would be impossible for me to make any progress, to make any impact whatsoever, if I was unwilling to confront the actual barrier to getting my fellow citizens to see things in the way I thought they should see them, which was the mountain, the avalanche of propaganda that was descending upon them on a daily basis from all directions, emanating from the country's most influential, wealthiest, and most powerful media corporations. And I knew, for example, when, say, reporting on illegal domestic warrantless spying or on many of the abuses of the War on Terror, that if I were unwilling to debunk and dismantle and dissect the propagandistic framework being fed to people to induce them to accept these abuses as something noble or necessary to guarantee their security, I would have no way of making any headway, of having my voice be heard beyond a very small and limited group of people already trained in constitutional law. And so very early on in my journalism career, I began adopting as a primary focus, even though that was never my intention, the lies that were being issued on the topics I knew most by the most powerful newspapers, by the most influential media outlets, because that was a way of getting people to clear their mind of what was being purposely put into it, the clutter that was being inserted into it, to prevent them from thinking critically. And as I did that, I began to view that work, namely the work of dismantling propaganda issued by media corporations on behalf of power centers, not just as a form of media criticism, but as a form of reporting. After all, if the goal of reporting, which is what I believe, is to show one's fellow citizens who don't have the time to engage in politics full time, who have families to take care of and other work to do, to show them the information in the public interest that they need to see, if that's the goal of reporting, then debunking media propaganda, showing them that what the media is telling them and inducing them to believe, showing them that it's actually untrue and baseless, is a vital way of reporting on the world. It's crucial for showing them what the truth of what is happening is, of what our institutions are actually doing. And from that very first year of writing, I learned that this attempt to isolate media criticism from real reporting was nothing more than an effort on the part of those media corporations to malign and discredit people who decided that all powerful actors and all powerful institutions, including media corporations, deserve to be subjected to that level of scrutiny. Now, one of the things that Steve talks about in his book and we talk about in this interview is the cultural change that journalism has seen over the last several decades. If you go back to the 1920s, the 1930s, even into 19th century journalism, what you will find is that journalism, which really wasn't so much a profession or thought of as a profession or a priesthood the way it is now, it was really an activity in which all citizens can engage, was really most commonly heralded in its muckraking form. These were people who really enjoyed, more than anything, almost sadistically taking down several pegs the elite institutions that like to drape themselves in all sorts of prestigious praise and all kinds of awards. And then when reporting became an actual way to earn a living in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, it was really a working class kind of a job. It was people who formed guilds in order to provide themselves a livable wage. And what it attracted more than anything was a personality type that I would describe as people who most enjoy throwing rocks out from the outside of elite events rather than being invited into those elite events. And what really changed more than anything the nature of journalism, in my view, was the corporatization of media. As media began to be more expensive, as you needed to own networks and studios and major printing presses, the kinds of things only large corporations could afford, that previously kind of that iconography of an outsider journalist with smudge and ink on their fingers, working late hours for little pay and the kind of slovenly dress got replaced by the mentality that corporations value most. The people who began to thrive within corporate journalism had the same kind of characteristics that cause people to thrive within any type of corporation. People who don't make waves, who are good at managerial tasks and doing what they're told. And it really began to incentivize the exact opposite kind of personality as what journalism used to encourage. And as a result, the idea began that the way you thrive in journalism is not to strip our most powerful institutions of their mythology or expose their secrets, but help elevate them and elevate respect for them and to serve their interests rather than undermine them. And that, more than anything, became one of the most important cultural changes in how especially corporate journalism works. And that's why, for that reason, the people who continue to choose to remain on the outside, who still have that personality type that they would rather be the people throwing rocks at those powerful institutions rather than being bestowed with all sorts of awards within them, to me are the people who are often doing the most important work. And they may easily be dismissed by condescending employees of corporate media outlets who never break stories, whose only basis of self-esteem is the titles they get within these corporations, but who nonetheless, you can call them media critics if you want, are performing the core function of journalism, which is showing that the emperor has no clothes, and most importantly of all, dissecting and shedding light on the lies that these institutions are disseminating and the reasons for it. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.